So yeah, I'm going to introduce Owen. He introduced himself earlier, but he's a restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy's Sagebrush Sea program based in Eastern Oregon. He has spent the last 6 years working to refine and field test new activated carbon seed coatings and pellets that allow for simultaneous application of pre-emergent herbicides with seeding of native species. He has a master's from the University of Nevada Reno and 20 years of experience in many aspects of sagebrush ecosystem conservation and research. He's focused on collaboratively identifying and implementing pragmatic actions that enhance ecosystem resilience and improve the success of restoration efforts.
Perfect. All right. I will jump right in then. Yeah, my name is Owen Baughman. I'm a scientist with the Nature Conservancy in Burns, and I will tell you a bit about a hopefully useful approach to restoration we've been working on in our system. I made no attempt to try to pretend I could adapt it to your system, so you'll just have to take what's useful. And then I'll also introduce the concept of using activated carbon in coatings on seeds to help achieve restoration goals in areas with lots of invasive annual plants. And again, this work is built around my experience and our work in the sagebrush sea, but invasive annual weeds are a shared problem, it sounds like. So, and I want to acknowledge that the work I'm talking about today is the product of many years of work from lots of people, including the co-authors listed here, but a whole bunch of others, including folks with the USDA Agricultural Research Service that we are housed with here in Burns. So just a quick orientation, semi-arid uplands where I work are suffering losses in complexity and function. And one of the main contributing factors to that is invasive annual plants. It's not the only contributing factor. There's others, including historic and current land use, changing climates and increasing droughts, and changes in fire frequencies. But all those other contributing factors kind of help ratchet up the invasive annual plant problem as well. So you give it an inch and it takes a mile. And in our system, we have these really diverse native assemblages of hundreds or thousands of species of grasses, shrubs, and forbs, and they slowly get invaded by invasive annual plants, and repeated fire that happens too frequently can just sort of turn them into these awful converted, invaded lands that are hard to move back up towards a native state. In our region, and I think to some degree in parts of places where you work too, recruitment from seed is, not a given. It's a naturally challenging thing, and it always has been. That's why plants live for many years and make seeds every year. In our system, droughty summers, cold winters reduce the chances for any given seed to actually turn into a plant. And we have really moisture limited uplands as well. And so combine that with super high interannual variability in when and how much precipitation we get in any given year. That means most perennial plants aren't recruiting every single year. Some years you'll get a great flush of native plants, and most years you actually won't. I don't know if that's true in your system, but it's good I find it good to remind ourselves that seeds are a bet that the plant makes, not a guarantee. And so there's lots of challenges. In our system, restoration and vegetation are pretty severely needed. Otherwise, we'll continue to see major biodiversity loss of plants and animals, continued loss of economic viability for local communities in our system, and continued loss of ecosystem stability and services, and some unfortunate, greenhouse gas emission things. Most of our intact wildlands are a bit of a sink, and they sort of turn into a source when they become invaded. And restoration efforts in our system are very large, but success is limited. The Bureau of Land Management alone, which manages most of our region of public lands, spends $10 to $20 million a year on seed. And since 1940, the average amount of acres that have been treated in some way for restoration or revegetation is almost 500,000 every year since 1940. So we're doing a lot of restoration efforts, which is great. I consider that a real asset. Success is very low. over the average, maybe even 10%, which means the cost of each successful acres is pretty high. But I still like to point out that as long as people are doing this work, it's a lot easier to improve how successful it is, because all you got to do is change how people are doing something rather than get a bunch of people to start from scratch. So this gets me to what I'm hoping can be somewhat useful for everyone here to think about too, which is something we sort of developed. There's a paper out there a few years ago that kind of has a little bit more detail on this, but we call it the precision restoration framework. And it's built around kind of how do we try to improve restoration success? And it's kind of a three-part, like everything else, it's kind of bubbled down into this sort of really simplistic three-part thing. But basically, you need to first identify critical and very specific barriers to success. You understand exactly why restoration is not working. And then understand and anticipate the spatial and temporal variability of those barriers that are reducing your success. So you need to know when and where those barriers are and how variable they are. And then, you target these barriers and the variability of them with the best available technique, or you innovate a new technique that is custom built to try to address that. And so in this paper, I won't go into super detail, but the three steps are kind of outlined in the blue boxes here. And you first sort of think, okay, what are my critical restoration barriers? And that can take a lot of time to figure that out, because failure is, the result, and the actual thing that caused failure can be sometimes pretty nuanced and complicated. So if you don't have any barriers, congratulations. I think a uniform restoration technique could work for you. But if you have barriers, you need to figure out if they vary in time only, or if they vary in space, or both. If there's not a lot of variability, you can usually target those barriers. I think invasive annual weeds can sometimes get in that group. You have them in certain spots every single year. So you can target them. But if there are a lot of temporal, if they are really variable, then you need to learn, like, okay, how can we predict this or map it? And so that's sort of a goal then, is to figure out how you can understand where and when those barriers occur. And this may result, if you can't really do that very well, you may need to combine or repeat techniques for the range of variation or spatial change that barrier exists on. Or if you can map them, then you can target the restoration in those areas, and or in the temporal window in which they occur. So again, there's some more details about this in the paper we have, but this can be applied for restoration planning. So like, you have a set of tools you're going to use, and you need to figure out when and where to use them, and you can use this approach for that. But you can also use this approach for developing new tools and understanding, okay, this is the green box we've arrived at, and we don't have any tools for that. So we need to think of a new tool that will help us address this. And so we use this in our research work, but also kind of advocate for people using it when you're not trying to come up with new tools. So you're just trying to figure out the best approach. And so what this sort of approach will do, will break your landscape up into different pieces that you apply different treatments to, whether it's seeding or just, treating for certain other things. And I think this is what you all do already in some degree or another. And so I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but again, it's, breaking it up into pieces and being sure there's no panacea and one size fits all approach is a good bet. But I like to point out, in our region, we have maybe 10% success. And if we could just get to 20% success, which is still low, we could potentially, and that's a doubling of our success. So that's great. And some existing tools and techniques that I'm sure that exist in our system, and probably are similar in yours, to help work through this approach. You can optimize your equipment and process to make sure you're really hitting the barriers. Maybe you need a different seed placement on the soil, or you need to optimize what seed lots you use or acquire, and figure out exactly where they go. And seed rates can be adjusted as well to address certain barriers. A lot of times just adding more seed can actually improve success, even though it's an expensive option. It is sometimes like that. That is how it works in some systems. And then you can also identify and achieve the best possible timing of activities. And so that's another thing that can work. And hedging your bets is sort of a catch-all term we use to suggest that maybe you need to try multiple things at once or repeat certain things, because that just increases the odds that you're going to, hit that temporal window when success happens. And trying things multiple times is not like, hey, I'm failing, I need to keep trying it. That's part of the approach to success in our systems. So in our system, the need is to give native perennial bunch grasses a leg up on the invasive annual grasses, because they are the kind of cornerstone of our system that's going to really hold the weeds back once they get established at a certain level. And so our annual invasive grasses are cheatgrass and medusa head mostly. Bentonata is becoming a problem, where across the Sagebrush Sea, there's potentially a million acres a year that are going from native dominated to invasive dominated. So this is a large scale issue for us. Herbicides are really commonly used to reduce these invasive annual grasses, mostly pre-emergent herbicides. And so we know that the herbicides really do work. The native grasses can hold weeds back pretty well once they're established. And so how do we make those two things happen at once? And the challenge for pre-emergent herbicides is timing. Pre-emergent herbicides work really well at preventing seeds from germinating. And you get with imazapic, which is the one that we've been using the most, you get about one good year of like almost no weeds, no annual weeds, but it also affects the seeds of native plants. And so unless you have established perennial grasses in there or established perennial plants, you kind of have an open slate, which will quickly get reinvaded by the weeds once the herbicide eventually wears off. And so there's this challenge of the best time to seed would be 1 year after the herbicide application, when the herbicides wore off enough that the native plants can germinate. But the best time to do it would have been at year 0, when you had full invasive annual grass control. And so this is where the idea of herbicide protection technology came in, and I did not generate this idea. In fact, it's been used in agriculture for decades and decades. But about 10 years ago, some folks here started thinking, like, how can we apply this to drylands? And so the kind of cartoon on the right sort of shows you the concept, which is that we package our seeds with some activated carbon and throw them on the soil, and then you spray herbicide, and the herbicide impacts the weed seeds, but our native seeds can just barely escape that herbicide by using the carbon. And once they get a little bit below the surface, the herbicide is no longer there. Most of these herbicides stay really close to the surface. This cartoon sort of shows some multi-seeded pellets that we used to use. We use smaller coatings that just have a single seed now, but so that's the concept, and the concept works. Herbicide is reduced around seeds by activated carbon. It does work, but it's been 10 years of trying to tinker and refine all of this to work in a rangeland setting with, the tools we have and the species we're trying to use. And so the USDA ARS started working on this in the early 2010s. A few years later, they partnered with TNC and to test prototypes. And as of 21, we've got a private seed coding company, Germain Seed Technology out of California, joined with us all on a partnership to really scale up the production, which was one of the challenges we had. And so we've done many, many lab and field tests over the years to try to refine and kind of hone in on the best formulation for these. It's many dozen lab trials, 25 field trials across 6 states, and we probably tested over 200 some prototypes. And I'm not mentioning this just to be like, hey, look at us, but it's like, this was very challenging to get these things to work well. And we're approaching a point where we're going to kind of say like, hey, here's what works, try this. And it looks pretty simple, but I just like to point out that like we tried lots and lots of things and we adjusted all the little levers and this works the best. And so it's kind of a tale of almost a warning, like if you want to jump into this from scratch, it's a bit challenging. And I'm going to go through super briefly some of the things we tested, not the results, but basically we've messed with the size and type of treatment. We used to have these large multi-seed pellets, but how large was a question. So we tried different sizes. They were made through a pasta machine actually, and we've upgraded now, or we stopped using pasta machines to make dirt pellets, which is great news, even though it was a lot of fun. But now we've adjusted to coatings, single seed coatings. We've also experimented a bit with slurries and powders, and that's what Sean was going to talk about a little bit, where you just apply carbon directly to the soil. You don't mess with the coating or the pellet. But then each species also may perform differently in each one of these different types of coating. So that's another thing we've tested a lot. There's the activated carbon itself. There's hundreds of different kinds of carbons out there for different processes, from industrial water filtration and agricultural stuff to all kinds of stuff. And so how much of it is needed, which chemical specifications are the best to work with seeds. Like one of them had a pH of like 11, which is really high, and our sagebrush just hated that. And how quickly should these technologies break down is another thing that sort of the different carbons have different particle sizes. And so we've tested a number of these. We've also explored different delivery methods. Ideally these things could just be broadcast. But we've tried different drills. Standard drills is in addition to sort of newer drills. We've done deeper or shallower furrows. We threw some out of drones. Our goal is to get existing equipment to be used, but we know that if this works well enough, that we would be able to consider some new delivery techniques, or we would be able to convince people to try some new techniques if there was such a good reward of success at the end. But we're still really trying to focus on using existing techniques. Pellets and coatings was a big shift for us. We worked really hard to try to get these large pellets that are made in a giant extrusion machine, like the one you can see in the middle, to work. But there are too many challenges, and any kind of industrial scale up we could try, which we tried some that would produce like tons per hour. It would just damage our seed too much, and you can see it on the left there. So we switched back to seed coating, which is a traditional thing that's used in agriculture a lot. But the initial challenge was that we couldn't get enough carbon on it, and we couldn't find any partners to do that work because it's an art and a science. But we finally got there with the help of Jermaine's seed coating. And so we want to make sure that industry and agencies are able to make, buy, and use these at scale, because in our system, we're talking thousands and dozens of thousands of acres in each restoration effort. And so we really want these things to not be, a boutique $50, an ounce kind of solution. So one more moment. Sorry.
What a trooper. He's probably sleep deprived too. So lots of interruptions. It's going to be hard.
Okay, sorry about that. The logistics was also an issue. Sometimes mass production can create new concerns about drying or storing these things. And also the mass production may be a different process than our initial production that changes the efficiency. And so there's just lots of things to look at here. And we've tried all these things, or most of them, and we've arrived at single seed coatings being kind of our best bet for this technology. And you can see here some grass and some sagebrush seed from these technologies. And before I go on to results, I want to say that part of our development of this with Jermaine seed coating has been that there's some intellectual property protections in place for them, but also the USDA ARS is involved in this agreement, and they don't set up these private partnerships unless there is going to eventually be a release of this technology for public use and for other people to produce and use. So it's not like a permanent patent that's in place, but it's basically provides enough intellectual protection to entice the company to participate and be kind of the first person on the market with this, but it protects from a situation where it could be like monopolized. And so we're unable to tell you exactly which carbons and the quantities and all of that of these technologies at this point, but we're not, we've been very careful to make sure that this will be something that can be widely available and not just from a single provider. But some recent results, before I talk about the graph, I can just show you, just look at the photo on top. In the very top left of the photo, you can see what happens where herbicide wasn't sprayed. We just have a huge, this is kind of later in the summer, just tons and tons of invasive annual grasses. And in the rest of the photo, you can see that gray litter color. That's the effectiveness of our herbicide. It worked pretty well. It got just about everything. And this is like a 6 ounce or 8 ounce per acre imazapic application. And on the left, you can see a square meter frame of coated seed, and on the right is the bare seed. And some of the grass you can see in the furrows is cheatgrass, but most of the plants are native bunch grasses. And so you can see when they get sprayed and seeded, we had quite success in the coated seed and the bare seed. And some bare seed does survive. It finds its way to little places where it can grow. And so it's not a zero success situation, but we're trying to just up that success. And so now looking at the graph, you can see there's 3 different species. We had sagebrush, and then 2 different grasses, bottlebrush squirreltail and bluebunch wheatgrass. And the bare seed is the lightest bar, and the carbon coating is the middle bar. And we also tried a loose carbon where we just put powdered carbon over these, which is not something that is easy to scale up in our system, but you can see that one or the other carbon coating produced generally higher, and this is late season seedling count, I should say. So as a percent of the seed sown. And so you can see none of these graphs go above 6% of the seed that we sowed turned into plants, which sounds low, but is actually not crazy. And so this year is finally the first year we've used some of these our most refined coatings. And so we're really happy to see that they're, in most cases, bringing that mean seedling survival up, and in a lot of cases, it's significantly higher. And this is all just first year results. And so obviously the plants in that coated treatment are bigger. We have some size data that I'm not showing you, but come year 2 or 3 or 4, those bigger plants are more likely to survive into future years, especially when the cheatgrass eventually reinvades. So we're looking to go out and monitor these sites again this spring. But our approach here has.
Hey, Owen, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
When is this picture from? Did you say that? And did you see it in the fall? What time of year? Yeah, and did you see it in the fall prior?
Yeah, I should say in our system, fall or really early spring seeding is what people do. I think mostly it's fall seeding for bunch grasses, and that's what we do. This combination of spraying and seeding has actually made a situation where we're actually seeding earlier than most people do, just because we don't want to spray too late. A lot of our invasive annual grasses will start greening up in the fall with the first good moisture. And so we actually try to spray and seed in like September-ish in some of our sites, a little earlier, a little later, depending on our sites. Some of our sites are all the way over in like Wyoming, but this one here is in Oregon. Yeah, so it's sprayed and seeded in mid to late September. And this picture was taken the following summer. And of course, this was last year. We had that crazy wet summer. So these plants normally would have been dormant, survived and alive, but they would have been dormant by this time the photo was taken. But we just had those weird summer rains, and they just kept coming. So yeah. So our approach with all this has always been to try to have the lightest touch of treatment for the largest scales. We need this to work over many thousands of acres. And so, but we also want to point out that this tool is not a silver bullet. Drought and weather variability is still a major barrier in the system. And Our seed coatings do nothing to help that. They don't increase moisture. They don't add nutrients to soil. They just have carbon, and they protect from herbicide. And they may help the seeds get a little closer to the soil because they're heavier than a normal seed, but still, a modest increase in survival against one barrier over a large area can still be a win for our ecosystems. And I think that's a useful approach to other restoration in general. And this tool has been kept simple for a reason, which is to be useful at scale. So, I think the last fun fact what I saw was that across the Intermountain West, if you look at the area that's dominated with invasive annual grasses, it's the size of Oregon. So big area. And, we truly believe a practical tool must not involve too many additional inputs. And so that's why we've tried to keep it simple. And we really want it to be compatible with existing restoration practices. And we think this is essential for partner adoption. So we've actually been working with that little green or that little yellow rangeland drill, which is kind of like the old pickup truck of cedars in the Great Basin anyway, that just everybody has them and uses them. And they were made in like the 70s, but we worked with one of those and made some modifications to basically the gear ratio so that it spits out seed faster, because our coated seed is so much bigger in volume than normal seed. The drill wouldn't spit out the amount of seed we needed to hit the rate. So we actually just changed a couple of gear ratios in a way that's reversible. You can just swap a chain. And then we also know that these coatings do better if they are in kind of a deep furrow, and that furrow can kind of throw some of the herbicided soil away. And so we added some extra weights and tried to make our furrows as deep as possible. So our next steps are to continue to field test our best prototypes across a bunch of sites, still mostly sticking with the Sagebrush for now. But as you can see, I'm here talking to you today, and we are interested in eventually building interest, especially for folks doing smaller kind of in between scale restorations that aren't 10,000 acres. I think that could be a great place for us to help proof of concept some of this stuff. And we're also trying to increase the number of species we're using. We had to keep it pretty small through our development process because it just is too many things to test, but we're trying to apply it to more species now. And with that, I will just say that there's a lot of people here and elsewhere that have been part of this work. I'm kind of the messenger here, although I've been involved with a lot of the nitty-gritty science on this for about 6 years. And so I would love to take any questions we have, unless Sean has the voice to talk a little bit about more, regionally appropriate work he's done in this space too.
So yeah, like I said, as an intro, I'm Sean Prive. I'm a botanist and plant ecologist at the Understory Initiative. We're a small nonprofit based in Medford, Oregon, and we are doing a lot of the same work that you all are doing up there, except for in our oak ecosystems down in Southern Oregon and Northern California. And we've run into a lot of the same problems that you have, in that anywhere we don't have continuous canopy cover, our open areas, oak savannas and grasslands are typically invaded by a mix of annual bromes, Medusa head, and increasingly now ventonata. And so we were interested in looking at different ways of dealing with this. Obviously, fire is an initial tool that we'd like to use here, but fire has to be very well timed, and it as a standalone action can actually increase cover of exotic annual grasses. They're extremely resilient to fire, and so properly timed fire and repeated or additional measures are almost always necessary. So we were looking for a space where we could test these new technologies after seeing what Owen was doing in our areas. And we just happened to be working with some solar developers in areas where some ag fields were developed as solar generation plants. And we had the opportunity to seed those with native species to develop them as pollinator habitat. But we were running into a lot of the same issues, and we couldn't use fire or a lot of the traditional tools. And so we were looking at some of these novel techniques, especially with these developers. They want a quick turnaround. It's usually, can you seed and have this be effective in the first year, not, 3 years of herbicide treatments and really setting the stage for success. So this is the way that the sites typically look when we adopt them. They're industrial sites. Their main purpose is energy generation. So at this particular site, the first thing that we did was level the ground and deal with the fact this was a cattle pasture beforehand. It was an irrigated pasture. And so we expected it to come back with, to grow back with pasture grasses, mainly Alipacurus, meadow foxtail. So we used a grass-specific herbicide to clear any of that was trying to come back, and irrigation was stopped. And what we saw, much to our surprise, is without the competition from the perennial pasture grasses, there were actually a lot of native forbs in the system that had somehow persisted that we were not able to see when those pasture grasses were there. So mainly bulb-producing species, camas, over about a third of the site was a dominant plant. But in and amongst the camas and Diclostema and Brodia and Tritolea plants, there were a lot of annual grasses and yellow star thistle coming in when the irrigation was stopped. This is a different part of the same site that didn't have any of those perennial species that we were tasked with, reseeding with wildflowers and native bunch grasses. And this was actually post grass-specific herbicide spray, and our herbicide applicator recommended using a pre-emergent called Esplanade or Indaziflam. Maybe some of you have heard of that, and it's an alternative to Imazapic that, sorry, we have a plumber here who's doing some work, so I was telling him. Our herbicide applicator recommended this chemical called Indaziflam as a longer lasting alternative to Imazapic. He had tried Imazapic on part of our property, and it was fairly limited success. I think because of our higher rainfall, it washed out of the system more quickly and really didn't provide the control we needed. So we did this test area with Indaziflam, and I can say that in these systems, Indaziflam is an incredible option if you are looking to get rid of these annual species quickly and you don't have a lot of annual natives that you're worried about losing. It's incredibly effective. However, if you apply it in areas with perennial or biennial weeds, be careful. They can be released from the competition and just explode in numbers and abundance. However, the camas and other perennial natives love it, and they are released from the competition as well. And so if you have a situation where you do have a lot of perennial cover still there, I highly recommend Indaziflam as an option to just release those from that exotic annual pressure. But we were faced with the same problem in that we couldn't reseed because Indaziflam is even more effective and longer lasting than Imazapic, and it will kill your native seed. We had almost zero success trying to seed when Indaziflam was in the soil. So we were looking to Owen's work, and the punchline here is that I think Owen's on the right track. They've done a lot more work than we have. We're really looking forward to being able to use their technology and purchase coated seed. So that's the headline here. But we did try this modified drill seeder. We had an herbicide applicator and machinist here modify our drill seeder so that we could spray the charcoal slurry over the top of our seeds. And essentially we just aligned these sprayer nozzles with our seed, where our seed was deposited on the ground. So we had a row of seed deposited with charcoal slurry sprayed directly over the top. That did work. The charcoal slurry definitely did neutralize the Indaziflam, but it safened the weed seeds probably more effectively than our native seeds. And interestingly, a lot of the natives that actually came back, or a lot of the species that came back through this were native annuals, like Claytonia species and things like that, or weeds that we weren't too worried about, like Valerianella. But in any case, we weren't satisfied with the degree to which this protected our seed from competition, but it is something to tinker with. It's something that does work in theory, and it's probably not scalable to thousands of acres, but if you have a 10-acre project that you can access with an ATV or UTV pulled seeder, this is something that you can do on a low budget and at a sort of DIY scale, and with some tinkering maybe could work. However, a lot of our sites were just overgrown with a lot of these species that came back in after that initial treatment. So we tried something else, which is just a dry charcoal powder in furrows. So we modified our drill seeder again to make a furrow and deposit dry powder that we just mixed in directly with the seed. We weren't too happy with this. I think this could be an effective option as well, but this was just our initial attempt, and the charcoal was too light, and sort of, you can see it sort of spread out over the surface, and just, again, protected weed seeds a little bit more than we wanted. However, it was, for some reason, in areas extremely effective. I don't know why some areas it was and some areas it wasn't, but especially outside of the shade of the panels, we did have a lot of success. And you can see a lot of these native wildflowers, and there are native bunch grasses and perennials that are sort of down on the soil. You can see some kind of in the bottom, just starting to establish. So this was actually successful in patches. And again, it needs tinkering. I think this is a viable option if someone worked to perfect this method. Just another view of the rows that were created when we tried this method. We collected a lot of data, and my colleague Maggie Graham really collected the data and is going to have a more well-prepared report and slideshow next season when we're done with this project. But you can see we collected data on these trials in square meter quadrats, and essentially, like I said, the punchline here is that I think Owen's technology is going to work better. We had success in patches, but you can see the pre-treatment data pretty much identical in the charcoal and control plots. The esplanade dramatically decreased exotic cover, so extremely effective in that case in 2022. And in 2023, we saw a rebound of exotic species in both treatments, but with high variance. So just a lot of variance all over the map. Same with native species cover, especially first year after treatment, the variance was extremely high. So we saw some with very high native cover and some with almost no native species at all. And that sort of equalized in 2023, when I think that the effects of the chemical were wearing off a bit, and the places where the charcoal protected both native and exotic species sort of regrew. And on to what we're going to try next. This is one of our Klamath-Siskiyou Oak Network project sites, where this is some chaparral / savanna that's sort of in between our oak thinning and burning sites. We went out and collected data on this last year. And to our surprise, we did not expect it to be highly colonized by Fentonata grass, but that's our main culprit right now, along with annual bromes and Medusa head, some yellow star thistle. And there are some native important native plants here, including camas and some of the other bulb producing species. Some native forbs have persisted in these environments, and a mix of Danthonia, Acnathrum, Romer's fescue, other native perennial grasses, depending on the soil conditions, are present throughout this, but it's 80 to 90% Fentonata grass at this point, mixed with those other annual grasses that I mentioned. And so we went in and did this heat mapping of patches of exotic annual grasses throughout our project area. This was just the first BLM treatment unit that we initiated just this fall. And we went and did a weed mapping exercise where we could do a heat map of where exotic annual grasses were most intense, and focus in on those with sort of targeted treatments. And we're hoping to use indaziflam in these areas because I think it'll be extremely effective at releasing the native perennials that are left. But what we're worried about is that there are important native annuals in these systems that will be lost. And we don't want to lose those species. It makes up a substantial amount of the native diversity that's still there. And so I think, we're talking about tens of acres as opposed to thousands of acres that Owen's dealing with, or tens of thousands of acres, or even hundreds of thousands of acres. It makes my head hurt to even think about those scenarios. So we can be really targeted here. backpack spraying and you know, distributing pellets with, you know, hand applications or small scale seeding equipment. And so we're looking forward to our next stage here with using additional technologies to protect our seed mixes, especially, like I said, those native annuals that would otherwise be lost. And we're really doing DIY methods here. This is something that I just did last weekend as an initial attempt at making seed balls. I think this is something that, you know, groups like ours could do for, you know, an acre or two of treatment. This is just a clay charcoal mix with some other ingredients to use as binders from information I was able to glean from the internet. And I think that this is probably going to be fairly successful for very small applications. That's my gut feeling after working with charcoal for the last 3 years, is that it's just a matter of dialing in how we apply the charcoal in combination with the herbicides that we select. And I'm doing very DIY compared to what Owen's doing. Really looking to him for guidance and his crew. But this is just like a really DIY initial experiment to see whether or not these seed balls hold up with indaziflam applications. So I've got a lot of thoughts on this. I think Owen's headed in the right direction. I'm looking forward to a day when we could just purchase or send our seed mix to one of the you know, industrial scale seed coating facilities that he's got lined up, and just write that into our grant proposals as one of the steps that we take to protect our seed, because I do think these pre-emergent herbicides are the way forward in these systems that otherwise are just going to be extremely tricky to convert back to native dominance. So that's really all I have to say, and would really like to network more with folks up there if you have thoughts on this. And I'm looking forward mainly to what Owen and his team are doing, because we would like to adopt that technology here. So thank you for the opportunity.